Hi, everybody. Welcome to my little corner of the world. Today, we're going to be talking about ambiguous loss. This is a type of loss that often goes unnoticed and is sort of hidden in the world of foster and kinship care. And so I want to bring you some information and education about what ambiguous loss is and how we can help children cope with it. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides to go over with you, and I really am grateful for this time with you today. So thank you for being here. All right, let's get started. So the title of this webinar is Navigating the Hidden Grief, Understanding Ambiguous Loss in Foster and Kinship Families. I am Beth Tyson, like I mentioned, and I'm the owner of Beth Tyson Trauma Consulting. You can find me on my website at bethtyson.com. I'm also a book author. I'm about to publish my second children's book, and I've been a co-author in two other books for adults. And then in the fall, I'll be publishing a new book for adults called Trigger-Free Parenting. And it'll be all about how we help ourselves heal our own trauma so that we don't pass it down to the next generation. I'm also a CASA advisory board member, and I was a CASA volunteer to two children in the foster care system for over 4 years. I'm also a trauma survivor and thriver. My mom passed away suddenly in her sleep one night when I was 26 years old. And so I'm very familiar with traumatic loss and PTSD and how it can really impact your life if you don't have support and help to get through it. Little housekeeping, I just want to let you know that today's webinar is not a substitute for professional mental health advice or medical advice of any kind. This webinar is copyright protected, so please do not record it or share it with anyone outside of this event without my permission. And you can always just send me an email or reach out to me on my website. And if you have any questions after the event, feel free to follow up with me via email at beth@bethtyson.com. You can take a quick picture of this slide so you have all my contact information and follow up with me later and see what I'm doing on social media. I have over 60,000 followers on LinkedIn. I have a Facebook group with about 7,000 members and a Facebook page with about 12,000 followers. So I hope to see you there. This is the book that I published about ambiguous loss. It's for children who are being raised in kinship or foster families, and they suddenly have to live with a relative or grandparent. And that transition can be really difficult on kids. It can also be very confusing because often adults don't know how to talk to children about these really hard things. They might be afraid of doing more harm, or they just don't know what to say. So the book also gives the language for adults to talk about loss and uncertainty and provides coping skills and mindfulness practices in a child-friendly and a child-appropriate manner. So I hope you'll check it out. It's available on Amazon. Today's agenda, first, we'll talk about what ambiguous loss is. We'll talk about the impact of ambiguous loss on children and teens. We'll talk about how to nurture some of that grief expression that gets frozen in the ambiguous loss experience. And then there'll be a live question and answer after the webinar. I like to remind people that this topic is sensitive and can bring up some pretty strong emotions, especially if you've never heard of ambiguous loss before and you might be struggling with it yourself. So I encourage you after this event to either write some notes in your journal, or make sure you process what you learned today with a friend or family member to help you process any big emotions that might come up. And remember, you won't remember everything today, but I hope that you can take some notes and gather some tools and strategies from me to help the children that you're serving in your schools. So what is ambiguous loss? It's a really big word, and sometimes it's a tongue twister, but it basically means that it's any loss that is unresolved or uncertain and ongoing. It's a framework and not a diagnosis for understanding grief that doesn't have to involve death. So often when we think of loss and grief, we think of somebody who has died and is no longer here. But with ambiguous loss, we feel grief about things and people and places that are actually still here, but we just can't access them in one way or another. And so it's a very different type of ongoing grief, especially for children and foster and kinship families. As I mentioned a moment ago, it is not a diagnosis. It is a framework for understanding what people go through with this type of loss. And it's a totally normal response to overwhelming and confusing circumstances. There are two types, and these two types were coined by Pauline Boss, and she is the founder or the originator of the concept of ambiguous loss. You can find lots of information and read her books online and just by going to her website, which I believe is ambiguousloss.com. Type 1 is a physical absence with a psychological presence. So this would be your foster care experience for children or kinship care, where the parent or the loved one is physically absent, meaning they're not in close proximity with the child very often, but psychologically, the adult is still very present in the child's mind and in their heart and in their body. So this is when we are sort of longing for someone who is out there in the world, but we just can't access them as much as we'd like to or very often. Type 2 is called psychological absence with physical presence. This is typically what you will see, the type of ambiguous loss you will see around people who are misusing substances or who may have mental health issues. So psychologically, they are not available to be there for the child, but physically they may be in their lives. So this can look like a parent who is still in the home with the children, but they are using substances to numb themselves and they're not able to be present with their child, or perhaps they have mental health issues that prevent them from being psychologically present, or maybe there's domestic violence happening in the house. And so the parent is unable to be there for their child the way the child needs and deserves. So this is type 2, and it's a psychological absence with a physical presence. Some everyday examples of ambiguous loss, just to make this more normalized, because I know for a lot of people it might be the first time you're hearing about it, but we all experience ambiguous loss from one time or another throughout our lives. Some common ones we've had to handle recently is a lot of the losses that adults and children experience due to the pandemic over the last 5 years. So we had losses of rituals and events, things like funerals and the birth of new babies. We often didn't get to participate in a lot of those really big events that we normally would. And so that's a type of loss that can feel like it's still out there, it's still attainable in some ways, but not totally able to be processed. Starting school for young children can be a type of ambiguous loss. So while they're at school, they really want to be with their parent or their loved one, but they can't, right? So while they're at school, they may be experiencing that feeling of grief and loss from the lack of or because of the separation from the people that they feel safest with. A breakup or a divorce is another form of ambiguous loss because, again, the parent is out there somewhere. They're just not in the child's everyday life. And so that would be like that type 1 ambiguous loss that's similar to foster care. Then we have some other things that are really like everyday things that can happen where maybe a parent is just preoccupied and on their phone all the time, and the child really feels ignored. And although the parent is in the room with them, they never feel seen or heard by the parent. That can create a type of ambiguous loss where we talked about earlier, which is the type 2, where the child is in the physical proximity of the adult, but the parent or loved one is checked out and unable to connect with that child the way that child needs them to. Moving to a new community is, something that is a normal part of life that some of us go through, and it can also bring up feelings of ambiguous loss for the place that they miss and long to be. So lots of times when people move, they feel a sense of ambiguous loss because that place is still out there somewhere. They're just not able to access it. And then pets who might run away or get lost or be in uncertain circumstances can also be another type. Military deployment and the loss of even a beloved toy can also be everyday types of ambiguous loss. In foster care and kinship care specifically, there are things that are considered ambiguous loss that we might not realize. So one of the things children lose when they come into care is their community, right? Their friends, their school, the teachers they see every day, the people that they trust to keep them safe. They may also lose contact, at least temporarily, if not long-term, with siblings who move into other homes. They've lost their role in their family. Oftentimes, children in care are moved into families of different cultures or religious beliefs, and so they lose access to their cultural rituals and religion. And then everyday material things like toys and clothing and even pets sometimes have to be left behind. And that can feel very overwhelming for children that are attached to certain items. Often when children come into care, they come with almost nothing or just a bag full of like immediate needs, things they need immediately, but they're unable to take their clothing, their toys, their favorite shoes, their blanket, their pillow. And that can be devastating, depending on how attached that child is to those belongings. The impact of ambiguous loss and why does this matter, right? That's what we kind of want to understand here today. I think you can sort of get an idea of why this matters, but we're going to go over it in some more detail. So with this type of invisible or ambiguous grief can lead to post-traumatic stress. And post-traumatic stress is a completely normal response to abnormal experiences or overwhelming experiences that disrupt our ability to function in everyday life. Ambiguous loss also leaves children and adults too without any closure. So there's no rituals associated with ambiguous loss, and there's no ending a lot of times to the situation that they're grieving. So a child who's in care for years and years and years may just be in a constant state of grief because they never know when they're going to get to go home or if they're going to see their parents again. Can be an explanation for challenging behavior. And it can also explain some learning challenges, because when children are preoccupied worrying about their parents or their loved ones or their siblings or their toys, their things, their pets, it becomes very difficult to focus on learning and remembering things at school and sort of meeting everyday demands from our academic life and sport life and all the things that children have on their plate. Those things become sort of a second or third priority to the first priority, which is their sense of safety and their concern for their loved ones. And I'm guessing you can imagine why some of this hurts, but we'll go over it anyway. There's often no social acknowledgement, so nobody typically talks to us about this type of loss, and we're left handling it on our own without any definition or vocabulary to even discuss this type of loss. So socially, it's not acknowledged, and it leaves us with this deep sense of grief and uncertainty that we can't even find the words to talk about. And that's what we're here trying to do today, is give people the language to have these conversations. It also creates family loyalty issues when it comes to foster and kinship families, because the child is living with a grandparent and they start to feel close to that grandparent. They may feel loyalty issues, or they may feel as though they are choosing favorites over their biological parents. And because the biological parent is still alive and out there somewhere, and maybe even partially in the child's life, the child may feel like, I can't get close to grandma because mom might get mad at me or dad might get mad at me, or I can't get close to my aunt because I may be going home next week and I don't want to be disloyal to my parent. There's also always the hope of reconnection, and that can just be heartbreaking for kids over and over again who have their hopes up that they're going to see mom or dad at a visit, and then the visit gets canceled, or they think they're going to be reunified and they're being told they're going to go back home, and then something happens and they're no longer able to go back home. So there's a lot of lingering in the child welfare system of children in care, and we've really, do children a disservice by giving them false hope and false promises of reconnection with their birth family. There's also the loss of the role in the family. So you may have a child who was the oldest child in one family be moved to a foster family, and now they're the youngest child. And so all of the things they learned being an oldest child, and sort of all the roles and duties that were expected of them, are no longer applicable. So they feel very lost, and they feel as though they've lost their identity in the family, and they can feel a lot of grief over losing that role as, say, the oldest child. And it can go other ways too. So if you're the youngest child and now all of a sudden you're the oldest child in a family, that can also create a lot of tension and confusion about how to behave and what's expected of the child. And ultimately, there's just a complete loss of control for these children, which is why we see them really trying to control everything they can in their lives, in order for them to feel as though they have a sense of mastery and autonomy. They will try to oftentimes act out and control situations through their behavior, through getting in trouble, or through just being defiant and unable to comply with adult requests. This loss of control makes us crave more control. And so we will control every little thing we can in order to feel safety. And safety really is the primary priority of our brains. So this is not something a child is doing on purpose or to manipulate people, but they really need to feel as though they are in control of something so that they can calm their nervous system and feel as though they have some certainty in their lives. And then there is the situation where adults often expect children who have been removed from dangerous homes or families to be grateful for where they are now. And we know from research and just lived experience that when you talk to children, they don't feel grateful for having to be removed from their biological families most of the time, especially because they often have relationships that are intertwined with the trauma they were enduring. So although they may be afraid of dad, they also really love dad, and they're confused about what love means and what love looks like. And so, even though they may be unsafe in that home and they now are in a safe home with a grandparent or foster parents, they can still really long for and wish to go back home. And in our culture, we value problem solving. We like things to be sort of finished and complete, and we like closure, and we like answers and certainty. And in these situations, there's very little certainty, and we're not able to solve the problems a lot of times for these families. And it goes on and on and on without solutions. And that can be very overwhelming and stressful for not only children, but also the adults who are involved. The psychological impact is what we'll discuss next. Give me a second here. I want to see what time it is. And we'll go through these. I have so much to share with you today. We'll go through these kind of quickly, but basically we become frozen in that grief. We have a sense of like grief limbo. We don't know where to go with our feelings. Children feel as though they are missing someone, but then they're always hopeful that they may have that person back in their life. So it's just a very uncertain place, and there's no place for their mind to really rest, which creates exhaustion and fatigue and wears down your ability to handle irritations and frustrations that just normally come up in life. And so that's why we sometimes see these big emotions and reactions from children who are suffering with ambiguous loss. It's because their tolerance is diminished for any additional stress, because they're already under so much stress with this grief limbo they're experiencing. Can lead to feelings of hopelessness and despair because there's just no ending in sight. There's no answers in sight. As I mentioned, the low frustration tolerance and difficulty getting attached to others. So if you have had this experience where you got attached to someone and you really, felt safe and close and in a loving relationship with them, and then suddenly they disappear, or they're unable to be reached or be part of your life, you're going to be pretty apprehensive to get close to somebody again out of fear that it might happen again. And our brain, again, its main job is to protect us and help us survive. And these rejections or abandonments can feel like threats to our survival. That's how painful it can be. We can literally feel as though we can't live without these caretakers and these or these parents that brought us into the world. And their main role was to protect us and help us survive until we could do it for ourselves. And so when you lose a primary parent or caregiver, instinctually, the child feels as though they can't survive, or they're threatened, their survival is threatened. And then there's the guilt and sadness and anger that comes up with ambiguous loss. For obvious reasons. And I talked a little bit about that guilt of feeling like disloyal to other people who are stepping in to support the child. You might see distress over routine changes. You might see difficulty with making decisions, difficulty coping with additional losses. That can definitely be a trigger and can activate the trauma responses for children. You might see anxiety disorders, panic attacks, depression, suicidal thoughts, or ideation. And these big feelings and mental health issues are most likely to surface during adolescence, according to research. Ambiguous loss is not only about grief, but it can also be traumatic. It can create developmental delays, hyper and hypoarousal, cognitive impairment, which is that, difficulty learning, listening, paying attention, remembering things, making sound decisions. Emotional dysregulation, that's those big emotions, so difficulty managing emotions and calming and relaxing our bodies. Sleep disturbances are another really common problem for kids who are experiencing trauma and loss. Some symptoms that you might see are a regression in development. So a child who was potty training now is refusing to potty train, or a child who started talking is no longer talking, or a teen who was starting to, branch out and become more independent, reverts to being more codependent on their caregivers. They may seek sensory input, or they may avoid sensory input. So this can look like a child who enjoys, lots and lots of sensory input, loud noises, real rough play, even getting hurt on purpose. And then there's other children who experience trauma who are very avoidant. They're very fearful of loud noises. They avoid rough play because it might remind them of the trauma they experienced. You often see inattentive and forgetful behavior, again, because the brain is so busy thinking about their safety and the well-being of their loved ones that it makes it very difficult to remember things and pay attention. They might have those big outbursts, or they may shut down. This can look like a child who just is refusing to respond to you. It's kind of staring off into space, doesn't hear you, doesn't see you. It's like you're not in the room, but the child is there, but to them, like they are somewhere else in their minds. And that's a form of what's called dissociation. I won't go into too much detail on that, but it is a red flag if you see children dissociating. It's a more serious symptom of trauma. You might also hear frequent physical complaints from children because they don't know how to come right out and say, I'm really missing my mom. But they can say, my belly hurts or I have a headache, and they will get the care and love that they need for the grief that they're feeling underneath. Of course, always have those complaints checked by a medical professional first and to rule out any physical problems. But if these are kind of ongoing, repetitive complaints that there's just no underlying cause for, it could be a trauma response. And one we're all probably pretty familiar with is that oppositional behavior. That oppositional behavior is the child's attempt at gaining control because they've lost control of so much in their lives. Having a little bit of control and pushing back on adults can feel powerful and can feel as though they have some level of control and certainty in their lives. Things that make it easier to cope are reasonable expectations for the children you're serving. So not expecting more from them than they are able to handle. Validating their feelings. So instead of, oh, stop crying, what are you upset for? You haven't seen your mom in months. Like, why are you upset all of a sudden now? That's incredibly hurtful for a child to hear. And so no matter how long it's been, or no matter what the parent has done or didn't do, just validating, like, I get it. This is really hard. It's really hard to be separated from your mom or dad or siblings, whoever it might be. Keeping your word. So building trust is paramount with these children because trauma breaks down the foundation of our ability to trust that we will be safe, that people will care for us, and that people will meet our needs when we have them. So the world and the people around us start to feel very unsafe and untrustworthy. So one of our roles as a caregiver now, or as a teacher or counselor, is to really be as honest as possible with children in age appropriate manner, but also really keeping your word and holding true to what you say when you can, and preparing them ahead of time if you can't, or if you have to break a promise for some reason. It helps to know that other people experience ambiguous loss. And so sharing about a time when you lost something important to you, or when there was a situation where you really longed for someone that you couldn't have in your life, this is a way to help children feel less alone. Of course, not with like dumping all your sad stories on the child. That wouldn't be healthy either. But just a mentioning of like, I know it's not the same, but when I was a kid, my dog ran away and I couldn't sleep for weeks because I didn't know what happened to him. And it was the worst feeling in the world. And I know it's not the same as being separated from your parents, but just want you to know that I do have a little tiny bit of understanding what that pain is like. And wow, I'm just so proud of you for all that you're handling right now. And committed relationships. Over and over again, the research shows us that when we have stable, consistent, compassionate, loving, committed relationships in our lives, we can overcome the challenges of trauma and we can heal from post-traumatic stress. And so really having at least one adult, that's what Harvard University research shows, is that having one committed, loving adult in a child's life who can show up for them over and over again is what mitigates the impact of trauma and loss in childhood. Some things that make it harder to cope are silence, meaning not talking about it at all, not acknowledging the loss, keeping secrets and being dishonest, feeling, a lack of safety or control in the child's life, untrustworthy adults in their world and in their space. Oops, sorry about that. And so these four things are really what shows and what makes it harder for kids to cope with this type of loss. So now we'll move on to nurturing some expression of the grief, because often this type of grief just gets repressed and hidden, and there's really no place to let it out in our culture. So we'll talk here about some things we can do. One thing I would love for you to do, I don't have time to play it right now, but if you go to YouTube and you search for All Connected, a place for belonging, you will find lots of videos for teens and young adults that are animated and really engaging and even a little bit funny at times to help them understand childhood trauma and loss. And this video, all the videos I helped co-create with an organization called Connect Our Kids. And we worked with a group of over 30 people with lived experience in the foster care system to help us really create meaningful and accurate depictions of what kids go through and how they can cope with it. So I encourage you to, again, to go to YouTube and use these videos to open up hard conversations with kids.
Today's episode is centered around a topic.
Power of your relationship is where the good stuff happens. It's in relationships that we heal from trauma. And again, it only takes that one loving adult that can help improve the long-term outcomes of mental health for children who experience trauma and loss. And if you would like more information on this study, you can just Google like the Harvard University one caring adult or something like that. And the research should pop right up. But this is research, again, that has been done in multiple different ways, not just by Harvard, but also by Johns Hopkins University, that shows what we can do and what children need in order to bounce back from life's adversities. Another thing we can do, a practical strategy, is helping kids think about both and situations. So a lot of times with trauma, we get into black and white thinking, like all or nothing thinking. And when it comes to this type of loss, it's more of a both and thinking. So you have conflicting feelings at the same time. So yes, I really want to be with my mom, and I can't be with her. And you might say that to a child in response to a big reaction or a big response from them, just validating like, yeah, you really, really want to be with your mom or dad. And at the same time, you're not able to. That's a lot to carry for a kid. So helping them think about how they have these two feelings and two desires at the same time, and that two things can be true. You really love your grandma and you really want to get close to her, and you're really afraid that if you do, you'll be disloyal to your family, your biological parents. Yeah, both of those things are true. We as humans have the ability to feel more than one emotion at a time. We can feel two or more. And that's okay too. And we need to normalize that for them, that, yeah, you're really scared and you're also probably really angry that this happened. Pointing out examples in everyday life or in your own life of times where you've felt, these both and feelings, and helping to normalize that this kind of happens everywhere, every day, where, we might want something but can't have it, or we may feel two things at once. Give them permission to feel those emotions, because oftentimes children learn like you can only be sad or you can only be happy. But it's more nuanced than that. It's more complex than that. Our emotional worlds are much deeper than that. And so they need to have the permission to say, yeah, you know what? It's okay to be happy on your birthday and also really sad that your mom's not there. One way we can do this is, or one way we can encourage this grief expression is really just identifying what was lost. So here I give you some examples. And this might look like, a worksheet that you print out and do with a child of, all right, let's talk about what you lost. What actually was lost here? And besides just the person or the relationship, maybe you lost your everyday routines. Maybe you lost your family role or future events that you hoped to have with those people, holidays, celebrations, culture, religion, all the things we talked about earlier. Help them identify what exactly they are grieving and be very conscious of this grief on celebrations and holidays, especially like birthdays, graduation, and other big accomplishments in a child's life. Maybe it's making the team, maybe it's winning a big game, but letting them know like, hey, I know that you're really excited about this and it's really awesome, but you know what? It's also okay to feel sad about mom, dad, sister, brother, whoever might be missing. Keeping our expectations reasonable around, holidays and other big events is also important because sometimes we expect children to be happy just because it's Hanukkah or just because it's Easter. And the truth is that it doesn't matter when you're grieving and when you are longing for somebody who you miss in your life. It doesn't matter what holiday it is or what celebration is happening. We oftentimes we don't feel happy. And adults expect children to be happy on those days. So lower your expectations of how they may respond to an activity in your classroom that's supposed to be celebrating a holiday. They may not want to participate, and that's okay. Maybe you can give them a different activity, and just being very sensitive to the fact that you never know what a child is grieving when we bring up these different holiday activities in school. Modeling healthy responses to loss. So, children learn best from us and from the adults around them. When we model grief expression, they learn how to do it for themselves. So if there is a loss that you're going through, it's okay to talk to them and tell them that you're feeling sad and tell them what you're doing to cope with your own grief and loss and model what that looks like in a healthy way. Now, it's not all about what's lost either. We can look at the positives and the things that were gained. Of course, first acknowledging the losses, that's the most important part. But once they have processed some of that, we might be able to get to a place where they can acknowledge things that they have found because of the situation that they're in. So identifying their gains and thinking about, what did you find because of this loss or because of these changes? Maybe you made some new friends. Maybe you acquired safety. Maybe you have a meal. Maybe they have, abundant food to eat now because they are in a household that can provide for them. So there's lots of things that are also found when children are removed from their biological families. We also want to redefine what family can mean for children. So we have still, even in this day and age, we have very cookie cutter definitions of what family is. It has to be blood related and, it's a mom and a dad and two kids. And, that's just not the reality for most folks nowadays. Family can be created. Your family does not have to only include your biological blood relatives. Family can be your best friend. Family can be your neighbor. Family can be a coach you're really close with or a counselor. We can redefine what family means and let them know that it's okay for that your family looks different. Some other things we want to help, especially young children with, is expressive free play. So art and playing with figurines and dolls or puppets are great ways for children to express themselves through play. And research shows that play is how children overcome trauma. So they work out the traumas and the loss in their bodies and nervous systems through play. And so the more opportunities we can give them to sort of act out these circumstances, to play and interact with dolls, toys, puppets, art materials. These are all ways that a child is internally processing their trauma And often we might not recognize it or give it value or even understand what the child is doing with their play. But as long as they're safe and not harming themselves or someone else, allow them to express themselves as much as they want through play. You can also talk about who is missing. So just not going silent on, these people that are so pivotal in a child's life, gave them life, and yet nobody talks about them or mentions them out of fear that they might upset the child um, or bringing them up might create more sadness or harm. And the truth is, we always want to talk about the people we miss. We're waiting for someone to bring up their name. We're hoping that you mention the fact that, so and so isn't there. We really wish they were. And I know that from my own personal experience. Now, not every person feels that way, and so I can't say it's all the time or in every situation, but you have to have some level of discernment to assess the child. You know them the best, you know them well. And so you notice if you bring up someone's name or talk about something, how the child reacts. If they immediately shut down and they don't want to participate, then we don't pressure, we don't force that conversation. But if you notice, hey, they were open to talking about this, or they're bringing up their name on their own, then that is a sign that the child will be fine with you talking about that person a little bit more. Could also create memory boxes. So these are boxes that we decorate, and inside we put special or important things that connect the child back to those people. So this may be photos, this may be jewelry, this may be a piece of a special blanket, this may be photos of a special place that they went together. It could be a book, it could be so many different things, right? But this is a memory box that children can go to. Maybe you create a ritual around it where it's once a day or once a week, where they go and spend time with these objects to help them process their grief. Some more things we can do are journaling, writing a letter, but not necessarily sending it to the missing person. Creating those rituals, maybe at dinner time or bedtime, around lighting a candle for the person who's missing, and visiting places that were special or important to the child. For teens and adolescents, this can look like maybe they join a support group with other people who are experiencing loss. They may be interested in creating art, music, or stories from their pain. A really helpful sentence that we can ask is, help me understand what you do know about your family, and writing it down. Giving back to others who are also going through something painful can be a way to make meaning with the loss. And so if the child has been in a place where they are able to process some of their grief, they may be interested in giving back to younger children who are also going through it. And it can just bring purpose and meaning to their pain. Some other things we can do are help them explore their culture if they've been disconnected from that. So that could look like cooking food together, baking special treats that are familiar, or things that they made with their biological family. Even doing searches online for genealogy. This might be for the older kids, teens and adolescents, where you can go on and really search and find out where exactly your family is from, and what information is available out there on your history of who your family was and who they were. This can be incredibly grounding and give children a real sense of identity, which is a big part of what's been lost in the process of foster and kinship care. Before we end, I just want to point out again that positive childhood experiences are what mitigate the impact of ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, which you're probably pretty familiar with if you're in the education sector. And so PCEs are the flip side of ACEs, and there's 7 of them. 1 is feeling supported by family, 2 is belonging in school, 3 is 2 non-parent adults who genuinely care about the child. 4 is the ability to talk to family about feelings. 5 is the ability to enjoy community traditions. 6 is feeling supported by friends. And 7 is feeling safe and protected at home. When children have even 3 or 4 of these positive childhood experiences, the research bears out that they have a reduced risk of mental and physical health problems throughout the lifespan. So these 7 things are really critical for children to have in their lives. The good news is that you can give that to them as their counselor, as their teacher, as someone who interacts with them. You can be that one of these positive childhood experiences that can mitigate the impact of trauma. So I really want you to soak this in and see where you might be able to provide one of these 7 things for children who are suffering with loss and trauma, because that is a corrective emotional experience for them. And the more times they interact with adults who are safe and loving and trustworthy, the more we rewire their brains to believe that they are safe and that they can trust the people in the world around them. So I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. The next thing we will do is have a little question and answer session. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'll see you again in a few moments.